Hello, everyone. It's Janae here. I am back. Today, we are going to finish off with the president. So, study the president with me, part 2. And I am just going to go ahead and get started. Yesterday, I talked a little bit about constituencies, and I have the definition of constituency right here. It says a body of voters in a specified area who elect a representative to be a legislative body. And so, again, yesterday we talked about constituency. And so that was where we left off in relation to the president. And so now we're going to talk more about the president. And I'm just doing a recap what constituency is. So it's a body of voters in a specified area who elect a representative to a legislative body. So a body of voters in a specified area who elect a representative to a legislative body. So down a little bit further, it has more information. It says the term constituency is commonly used to refer to an electoral district, especially in Britain English, but it can also refer to a body of eligible voters or all residents of the represented area or only those who voted for a certain candidate. So more about constituency. Use constituency in a sentence. Noun. The definition of a constituency is a body of people who are eligible to vote and elect a leader or a group of supporters or potential supporters. The people in a given geographic area who elects a congressman are an example of a constituency. Okay, so that's constituency. Now I'm gonna read about public approval. So all of these constituencies are impressed by presidents who maintain a high level of public approval, as this is very difficult to accomplish. Presidential popularity, and measured by national polls, gives the president legislation. As you would note from figure 12.2, patterns for almost all presidents are common. Presidential approval ratings tend to be very high when a new president takes office. The honeymoon period and decline to a low in the last 2 years of the second term. Spikes in public approval, apart from that cycle, tend to occur when the United States sends troops in harm's way. This is the rally round the flag effect. Look at George H. Bush rating. Popular approval of the president reached a new high at the beginning of the Persian Gulf War, but that approval had no staying power, and his ratings declined precipitously in the year following the victory. Bill Clinton defined all traditions by having high ratings even while he was fighting impeachment. So I can show you this figure here. It's a picture, public popularity of modern presidents. This might be difficult to see. And then the orange in the middle Do you see the orange in the middle? So that one's George Bush. This one. All right, so that is the public popularity of modern presidents. And note that just because you're the most popular doesn't mean that you're going to be president, right? If you get like voted in, it depends on like the electoral votes. But these are the popular presidents. So it says that George Bush was really popular. And then, as noted in the text here, it said that there were U.S. Troops that were, I think they were sent to like war. Let's see, let's go back. So it says that there's a pattern almost with all presidents. President takes office, so the honeymoon period, and then it declines to a low in the last 2 years of the second term, and then spikes in public approval apart from that cycle tend to occur when the United States sends troops in harm's way. So this is a rally around the flag effect. So when they send the troops out, like, then their ratings go up. So George W. Bush and the public opinion polls. The impact of popular approval on a president's prospects was placed in a sharp relief by the experience of the second President Bush. Immediately after September 11th, 2001, Bush had the highest approval ratings ever recorded. His popularity then entered a steep decline that was interrupted only briefly by high ratings during the early phases of the Second Gulf War. During his second term, Bush's approval ratings reached new lows, falling to less than 30% by 2008. Without question, the economic crisis of fall 2008 contributed to the final low ebb of his approval ratings. Obama and Trump public approval. Like most presidents who win office with a substantial margin of victory, President Obama entered office with very high approval ratings. His high standing with the public lasted throughout his first year in office. As the recession deepened, his ratings declined to the mid-50s, and he ended his term with an approval rating of 57%. At his inaugural, President Trump's public approval rating was just over 40%, a significant low for a newly elected president. Throughout his first year in office, his approval ratings hovered around 39%. Although the public had higher approval for his economic and foreign policies, it is likely that his personal conduct caused the low personal ratings, while the public approved of his policy initiatives. Going public. In the 1800s, only 7% of the presidential speeches were addressed to the public. Since 1900s, 50% have been addressed to the public. Scholar Samuel Cornell has proposed that the style of presidential leadership has changed since World War II, due partly to the influence of television, with a resulting change in the balance of national politics. Presidents frequently go over the heads of Congress to the political elites, taking over cases directly to the people. This category, which Cornell dubbed going public, gives the president additional power through the ability to persuade and manipulate public opinion. By identifying their own positions so clearly, President weakened the ability of Congress to modify their agenda. Given the increasing importance of the media as their major source of political information for citizens and elites, presidents will continue to use public opinion as part of their arsenal of weapons to gain support from Congress and to achieve their policy goals. Special uses of presidential power. Explain the emergency powers of the president and the executive powers of the president. Presidents have at their disposal a variety of special powers and privileges not available in any other branches of the U.S. government. Emergency powers, executive powers, and executive privileges. Emergency powers. The Constitution does not mention additional powers that the executive office may exercise during national emergencies. The Supreme Court has indicated that an emergency does not create power, but it is clear that presidents have used their inherent powers during times of emergencies, particularly concerning foreign affairs. The emergency powers of the president were first emancipated in the United States versus Curtis Wright Export Court. In that case, President Franklin Roosevelt, without congressional authorization, ordered an embargo on the shipment of weapons to two warring South American countries. The court recognized that the president may exercise inherent powers in foreign affairs and that the national government has primacy in these affairs. Abraham Lincoln suspended civil liberties at the beginning of the Civil War, 1861-1865, and called the state militias into national service. These actions and his subsequent governance of conquered areas and even of areas of northern states were justified by claims that they were essential to preserve the Union. President Truman authorized the federal seizures of steel plants and their operations by the national government in 1952 during the Korean War. Truman claimed that he was using his inherent emergency power as chief executive and commander-in-chief to safeguard the nation's security. As an ongoing strike by steel workers threatened to supply of weapons to the armed forces. The Supreme Court did not agree, holding that the president had no authority under the Constitution to seize private property or to legislate such action. This was the first time a limit was placed on the exercise of the president's emergency powers. After September 11, 2001, the Bush administration pushed several laws through Congress that granted more power to the Department of Justice and other agencies to investigate possible terrorists. Many of these provisions of the Patriot Act and other laws have been reaffirmed by Congress in subsequent years, whereas others have been revised. In 2006, it became clear that the President Bush had also authorized federal agencies to eavesdrop on international telephone calls without a court order when the party overseas was suspected of having information about terrorism or might be suspect in a terrorist plot. This eavesdropping had not been authorized under the legislation. Many scholars claim that this exercise of presidential power was far beyond what could be claimed an emergency power. The Bush administration claimed that it was entirely within the president's power to make such an authorization, although it did not claim the authorization to be within the Supreme Court's definition of emergency power. Following these disclosures, the administration pursued an expanded law to allow such wiretapping. But provisions of that new bill proved too controversial to pass in 2008. President Obama's administration did not attempt to pass any legislation on this matter. In 2013, however, the revelations of Edward Snowden made it clear that the eavesdropping program was still in act, and in fact, the National Security Agency, NSA, was now collecting almost all landline telephone data, both within the United States and from the United States to other nations. The president, after appointing a commission to make recommendations, announced that some limitations on this program might be possible. Executive orders. So the definition of executive order is a rule or regulation issued by president that has the effect of law. Executive orders can implant and give administrative effect to provision in the Constitution, to treaties, and to statutes. So executive orders Congress allows the president and administrative agencies to issue executive orders that have the force of law. These executive orders can enforce legislative statutes, enforce the Constitution or treaties with foreign nations, and establish or modify rules and practices of executive administrative agencies. An executive order then represents the president's legislative power. The only requirement is that under the Administrative Procedure Act of 1946, all executive orders must be published in the Federal Register, a daily publication of the U.S. government. So all executive orders must be published in a Federal Register, which is a daily publication of the U.S. government. So I have another definition of Federal Register. It's a publication of the U.S. government that prints executive orders, rules, and regulations. Executive orders have been used to establish procedures to implement national affirmative action regulations, to restructure the White House bureaucracy, to classify government information as secret, to establish military tribunals for suspected terrorists, and to order federal agencies to provide benefits to legally married same-sex couples. It is important to note that executive orders can be revoked by succeeding presidents. George H.W. Bush issued an order to ban foreign aid to countries that include abortion in their family planning strategies because that provision, the Heidi Amendment, could not make it through the Congress as legislation. President Clinton revoked the order. The George W. Bush administration revoked many of the thousands of executive orders and regulations issued in the last months of the Clinton administration. Not surprisingly, the Obama administration revoked a number of Bush orders and issued orders in support of stronger environmental regulations, food safety, consumer safety, and many other areas. In the last year of the presidency, President Obama and his administration issued a number of orders dealing with the environment. As soon as President Trump was inaugurated, he proceeded to follow up on his promise to repeal many of the Obama executive orders. He signed orders approving the Dakota pipeline, reducing regulations on oil and gas drilling and on coal mining. He also signed a number of orders modifying the Affordable Care Act. Among his most controversial orders were those banning entry visas to citizens of several Muslim majority nations. Executive privilege. Another inherent executive power claimed by presidents concerns the ability to withhold information from or refuse to appear before Congress or the courts. This is called executive privilege, and it relies on the constitutional separation of powers for its basis. Presidents have frequently invoked executive privilege to avoid having to disclose information to Congress on actions of the executive branch. Critics of executive privilege believes that it can be used to shield from public scrutiny executive actions that should be open to Congress and to the American citizenry. So, executive privilege is the right of executive officials to withhold information from or refuse to appear before a legislative committee. So, to avoid having to disclose information to Congress on actions of the executive branch. So, limiting executive privilege. Limits to executive privilege went untested until the Watergate affair in the early 1970s. 5 men broke into the headquarters of the Democratic National Committee and were caught searching for documents that would damage the candidacy of the Democratic nominee, George McGovern. Later investigation showed that the break-in was planned by members of Richard Nixon's campaign committee and that Nixon and his closest advisors had devised a strategy for impeding the investigation of the crime. After it became known that all of the controversies held in the Oval Office had been tape recorded on a secret system, Nixon was ordered to turn over the tapes to the special prosecutor. Nixon refused to do so, claiming executive privilege. He argued that no president can function if the private papers of his office, prepared by his personal staff, were open to public scrutiny. In 1974, in one of the Supreme Court's most famous cases, United States versus Nixon, the justice unanimously ruled that Nixon hand over the tapes. The court held the executive privilege could not be used to prevent evidence from being heard in criminal proceedings. Clinton's attempted use of executive privilege. The claim of the executive privilege was also raised by the Clinton administration as a defense against the aggressive investigation of Clinton's relationship with the White House intern Monica Lewinsky by independent counsel Kenneth Starr. The Clinton administration claimed executive privilege for several presidential aides who might have discussed the situation with the president. In addition, Clinton asserted that his White House counsel did not have to testify before the Starr grand jury due to Attorney Clinton privilege. The Department of Justice claimed that members of the Secret Service who guard the president could not testify about his activities due to a protective function privilege inherent in their duties. The federal judge overseeing the case denied the claims of privilege, however, and the decisions was upheld on appeal. Abuse of executive power and impeachment. Explain the process by which a president could be impeached and forced to leave office. President normally leaves office either their first term has expired and they have not sought or won re-election, or because having served 2 full terms, they are not allowed to be elected for a third term due to the 22nd Amendment passed in 1951. 8 presidents died in office, but a president may leave in another way: impeachment and conviction. Article 1 and 2 of the Constitution authorize the House and Senate to remove the president, the vice president, or other civil officers of the United States for committing treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. According to the Constitution, the impeachment process begins in the House, which impeachment accuses the federal officer involved. In the House, voters if the House votes to impeach the officer, it draws up articles of impeachment and submits them to the Senate, which conducts the actual trial. No president has ever actually been impeached or convicted, and thus removed from office. By means of this process, President Andrew Johnson served 1865 to 1869, who succeeded to the office after the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, was impeached by the House but acquitted it by the Senate. More than a century later, the House Judiciary Committee approved articles of impeachment against President Nixon for his involvement in a cover-up of the Watergate break-in of 1972, informed by members of his own party that he would not survive the trial in the Senate. Nixon resigned on August 9th, 1974, before the full House voted on the articles. Nixon is the only president to have resigned from office. The second president to be impeached by the House but not convicted by the Senate was President Clinton. In September 1998, independent counsel Kenneth Starr submitted the findings of his investigation of the president on the charges of perjury and obstruction of justice. The House approved 2 charges against Clinton: lying to the grand jury about his affair with Monica Lewinsky and obstruction of justice. The articles of impeachment were then sent to the Senate, which acquitted it Clinton. Do y'all know what acquitted it means? This is some really good stuff here. So acquitted it means to free someone from criminal charge by a verdict of not guilty. So I know, like, we talked a little bit about in class how there was a time years ago where people would vote. Like, voting was so important to the people. And there was like well over 60%. I think it might have been like in the 90s percent, where definitely way more than half, definitely like 70, 80, 90%, like a majority of the population will vote. And so now people aren't really voting like they used to vote. And a lot of people aren't really believing in the government like they used to, like years and years ago. And so we can see that here, like just looking at the power being abused and people covering things up, and it removes the faith. It kind of weakens and it makes you almost equalize, where it's like, oh, you're just a human being like everyone else. And, you make mistakes like everyone else. And which is true, like we're all human beings, but we definitely do esteem our leaders, in these positions, like out of all these people, like there has to be someone, you would think that you can look to, that's doing the right thing, that has the knowledge, that's going to be able to lead you where you want to go and take really good care of you. And that's just like when I think about leaders that are in those positions that we uphold, the expectation is for you to be that. We need you to be that. Like we need someone to look to. And, this is interesting. Yeah, I'm talking about impeachment. So there hasn't been a president impeached at all. Again, there has been some who've been discovered about their wrong covering up the Watergate incident and, the other incident with Clinton and Monica Lewinsky. So these things that are wrong, like they've either removed themselves or, maybe the Senate just didn't convict them. And I think one of the reasons, like they know that they're wrong, and going through that process of embarrassment, is, come on, you're pushing it. But yet they haven't impeached a president yet. And so that lets down the people, it lets down their system. And so they try to get the really good people, is what I think. They try to get like the really, really good people, the people we vote for in these positions. And, I feel like when they let them down, then I think it lets Congress down. Like when the president kind of lets down the people and then the Senate has to like convict them, I think it lets them down too. I think it just kind of, it weakens everyone, and it shows us our humanity, that we're human and we all make mistakes. It's something like we definitely do want our really good people to be in those positions. And it's unfortunate because we're human beings and sometimes we do things that are outside of our character. And I'm not trying to like justify it, but like that's just reality. Like that's what I think. Like sometimes we do things wrong, and yeah, so that's interesting how that works. But so the next section is going to be about the executive organization and then the vice presidency, and then I'll be done. So 2 more sections. So the executive organization. Describe the executive office that supports the president. Gone are the days when presidents answered their own mail, as George Washington did. It was not until 1857 that Congress authorized a private secretary for the president to be paid by the federal government. Woodrow Wilson typed most of his correspondence, even though he did have several secretaries. At the beginning of Franklin Roosevelt's tenure in the White House, the entire staff consisted of 37 employees. With the New Deal and World War II, however, the presidential staff became a sizable organization. Today, the executive organization includes a White House office staff at about 600, including part-time employees and others who are borrowed from their departments by the White House. The more than 460 employees who work in the White House office are closest to the president. The employees who work for a numerous council and advisory groups support the president, of whom is the presidential officer of a government department, are perhaps the president's most helpful advisors. I'm going to go back. I think I skipped over a line. I'm sorry. I'm such a good reader. Yeah, I know. Thank you. So the employees who work from the numerous councils and advisory group support the president on policy and coordinate the work of departments. Cabinet members, each of whom is the principal officer of a government department, are perhaps the president's most helpful advisors. So we're talking about the executive organization, the different staff members. So the president has a secretary. We know there's 460 employees who work in the White House office, and they're the closest to the president. And then there's a numerous workers that are councils, and they're in the advisory group, and they support the president on policy and coordinate the work of departments. And then there's the cabinet members. Okay, so the cabinet is an advisory group selected by the president to aid in making decisions. The cabinet includes the heads of 15 executive departments and others named by the president. Although the Constitution does not include the word cabinet, it does state that the president may require the opinion in writing of the principal officer in each of the executive departments. All presidents have turned to an advisory group or cabinet for counsel. Members of the cabinet. Originally, the cabinet consisted of only 4 officials: the Secretary of State, Treasury, and War, and the Attorney General. Today, the cabinet numbers 14 departments, secretaries, and the Attorney General. The cabinet may include others as well. The president can, at his or her discretion, ascribe cabinet rank to the vice president, the head of the office management and budget, the national security advisor, the ambassador to the United Nations, or others. Often, a president will use a kitchen cabinet to replace the formal cabinet as a major source of advice. The term kitchen cabinet originated during the presidency of Andrew Jackson, who relied on the counsel of close friends who often met him in the kitchen of the White House. A kitchen cabinet is an informal group of advisors, usually friends with whom the president worked before being elected. Presidential use of cabinets. Because neither the Constitution nor statutory law requires the president to consult with the cabinet, its use is purely discretionary. Some presidents have relied on the counsels of their cabinets more than others. Dwight Eisenhower was used to the team approach to solving problems from his military experience, and therefore he frequently turned to his cabinet for advice on a wide range of issues. More often, presidents have solicited the opinions of their cabinets and then done what they wanted to do anyway. After a cabinet meeting in which a vote was 7 nays against his 1A, Lincoln supposedly said, 7 nays and 1A. The A's have it. In general, few presidents have rallied heavily on the advice of their cabinet members. It is not surprising that presidents tend not to rely on their cabinet members' advice. Often, the departmental heads are more responsive to the wishes of their own staff or to their own political ambition than they are to the president. They may be more concerned with obtaining resources for their departments than with achieving the goals of the president. So, a strong conflict of interest between presidents and their cabinet members often exists. The executive office of the president. When the president Franklin Roosevelt appointed a special committee on the administrative management, he knew that the committee would conclude that the president needed help. The committee proposed a major reorganization of the executive branch. Congress did not approve the entire reorganization, but did create the Executive Office of the President, EOP, to provide staff assistance and to help coordinate the executive bureaucracy. Since then, many agencies have been created within the EOP. These agencies include the following: White House Office, White House Military Office, Office of the Vice President, Council of Economic Advisors, Office of National Drug Control Policy, Office of Science and Technology Policy, Office of the United States Tape Representative. Executive Office of President, EOP, is an organization established by President Franklin D. Roosevelt to assist the president in carrying out major duties. You guys enjoying this session so far? The list continues. Council on Environmental Quality, President's Critical Infrastructure Production Board, Office of Management and Budget, National Security Council, President's Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board, Office of National Age Policy. Several of the offices within the EOP are especially important, including the White House Office, the Office of Management and Budget, and the National Security Council. The White House Office. The White House Office includes most of the key personal and political advisors to the president. Among the groups held by these aides are those of the legal counsel of the president, secretary, press secretary, and appointment secretary. In all recent administrations, one member of the White House office has been named chief of staff. This person, who is responsible for coordinating the office, is also one of the president's chief advisors. Often the individuals who hold these positions are recruited from the president's campaign staff. Their duties, mainly protecting the presidential political interests, are similar to campaign functions. Most observers of the presidency agree that contemporary presidents continue their campaign after their inauguration. The permanent campaign is a long-term strategy planned by the White House Office of Communication with the press secretary to keep the president's approval ratings high and to improve the support of Congress. So I'm going to go back a little bit, talking about the permanent campaign. That is a coordinated and planned strategy carried out by the White House to increase the president's popularity and support. So the campaign includes stage events, symbolic actions, and controlled media appearances. During the Obama presidency, this function rose to a new height with the adoption of all forms of the electronic media. Anyone who worked in either of his campaign or signed up for presidential updates received emails from the president or Joe Biden or the First Lady on a weekly basis with information about the president's initiative. The White House also sends out tweets and posts information on all social media sites. The president's overall agenda is featured on the official White House website with links to policy priorities. The president may establish special advisory units within the White House to address topics the president finds especially important. Under George W. Bush, these units also include the Office of Faith-Based and Community Initiatives and the USA Freedom Corps. The White House office also includes the staff members who support the First Lady. The president is also supported by a large number of military personnel who are organized under the White House Military Office. These members of the military provide communications, transportations, medical care, and food services to the president of the White House staff. Employees of the White House office have been both envied and criticized. The White House office, according to the most former staffers, grants its employees access and power. They are available to use the resources of the White House to contact virtually anyone in the world by phone, text, satellite, telephone, or email, as well as to use the influence of the White House to persuade legislators and citizens. So, because of this influence, staffers and are often criticized to overstep the bounds of the office. The appointments secretary is able to grant or deny senators, representatives, and cabinet secretaries access to the president. So you all get that. It says employees of the White House have been both envied and criticized. They are able to use the resources of the White House to contact virtually anyone in the world by phone, text, satellite phones, or email, as well as the use of the influence of the White House to persuade legislators and citizens. The press secretary grants the press and television journalists access to any information about the president. The first year of Trump's White House was characterized by turmoil and staff turnover. The press secretary and chief of staff were replaced. Adding to the general sense of disorder was the Mueller investigation. Attorney General Jeff Sessions recused himself from the investigation because he had been an advisor to the 2016 campaign. Robert Mueller was named a special counsel to investigate possible collusions between the Trump campaign and the Russian attempts to influence the election. Some individuals who might have been part of the president's staff were caught up in the investigation, which continued throughout 2017 into 2018, adding to the stresses of the White House office. The Office of Management and Budget. The Office of Management and Budget, OMB, was originally the Bureau of the Budget, created in 1921 within the Department of Treasury. Recognizing the importance of this agency, Franklin Roosevelt moved it into the White House office in 1939. Richard Nixon reorganized the Bureau of the Budget in 1970 and changed its name to reflect its new managerial function. It is headed by a director who must create the annual federal budget that the president presents to Congress each January for approval. In principle, the director of the OMB has broad fiscal powers in planning and estimating various parts of the federal budget because all agencies must submit their proposal budget to the OMB for approval. In reality, it is not so evident that the OMB truly can affect the greater scope of the federal budget. Rather, the OMB may be more important as the clearhouse for legislative proposal insisted in the executive agencies. So again, the OMB is also known as the Office of Management and Budget, which is a division of the executive office of the president. So the OMB assists the president in preparing the annual budget, clearing and coordinating departmental agency budgets, and supervising the administrative of the federal budget. The National Security Council. The National Security Council, NSC, is a link between the president's key foreign and military advisors and the president. Its members consist of the president, the vice president, and the Secretary of State and Defense, plus other informal members. Included in the NSC is the President's Special Assistant for National Security Affairs. In 2001, Condoleezza Rice became the first woman to serve as a President's National Security Advisor. In 2013, former ambassador to the United Nations, Susan Rice, became the National Security Advisor. Policy SARS. For many decades, the president have created positions within the executive office of the president that were focused on one special policy area. Many have been titled Senior Policy Coordinator or Senior Advisor, and most of them have been appointments that do not require Senate confirmation. In general, these positions last only as long as the president. Each new president decides which domestic or foreign policy issues need special attention from an individual who can report directly to the chief executive. In recent administrations, the nickname Policy Czar has been attached to these positions. So Policy Czar is a high-ranking member of the executive office of the president appointed to coordinate action in each one specific policy area. If the president has special counsels or problems such as drugs or the environment of cabinet departments or independent agencies designated to handle an area of government policy, why does the president need yet another individual to supervise government action? President expects a policy czar to focus on the problem, along with coordinating the efforts of all the other government agencies that have authority in that policy area. The individuals named to these positions are often well-regarded experts who can bring an outsider's point of view, both to the president and to the agencies involved in dealing with an issue. George W. Bush, over the 2 terms of his presidency, appointed more than 30 individuals into these positions. President Obama created more than 40 positions in the executive office of the president to advise him on specific issue areas and to coordinate the work of the cabinet departments on such topics as healthcare reform, climate change, and urban incentives. Criticism of his decision to create so many special advisors range from the cost to the effectiveness of having people in places to oversee the work of the cabinet secretaries. But his authority to do so was unquestionable. When Congress managed to defund 4 of these positions in 2011, Obama noted that he could bypass that provision to appoint the advisors that he needed. Sometimes an individual who has held one of these positions is then appointed to a regular administrative position. So we said that policy czars are high-ranking members of the executive office of the president appointed to coordinate action in one specific policy area. The last one is the vice presidency. So describe the job of the vice president and explain the circumstances under which the vice president becomes president. The Constitution does not give much power to the vice president. The only formal duty is to preside over the Senate, which is rarely necessary. The obligation is fulfilled when the Senate organizes and adopts its rules, and when the vice president is needed to decide a tie vote. In all other cases, the president pro tem manages parliamentary procedures in the Senate. The vice president is expected to participate only informally in senatorial deliberations, if at all. The vice president's job. The vice president have traditionally been chosen to balance the ticket to attract groups of voters or appease party factions. If a presidential nominee is from the North, choosing a vice presidential nominee from another region of the country may be a good strategy. If the presidential nominee is from a rural state, perhaps someone with an urban background would be most suitable as a running mate. Presidential nominees who are strongly conservative or strongly liberal would do well to have vice presidential nominees who are more in the middle of the political road. Strengthening the ticket. In recent presidential elections, vice presidents have often been selected for other reasons. Bill Clinton picked Al Gore to be his running mate in 1992. Even though both were Southerners and moderates, the ticket appealed to Southerners and moderates, both of whom were crucial to the election. In 2000, George W. Bush, who was subject to criticism for his lack of federal government experience and his lightweight personality, chose Dick Cheney, a former member of Congress who had also served as Secretary of Defense. Both presidential candidates in 2008 sought to balance their perceived weakness with their vice presidential choices. Barack Obama chose Senator Joseph Biden to add experience and foreign policy knowledge to his ticket. And in 2012, Republican nominee Mitt Romney selected Representative Paul Ryan of Wisconsin to be his running mate. Trump selected Mike Pence, a conservative from Indiana, as his vice president nominee to gain votes from conservatives in the Republican Party. Supporting the president. The job of vice president is not extremely demanding, even when the president gives some specific tasks to vice president. Typically, vice presidents spend their time supporting the president's activities. During the Clinton administration, 1993 to 2001, however, Vice President Al Gore did much to strengthen the position by his aggressive support for environmental protection policies on a global basis. He also took a special interest in areas of emerging technology and lobbied Congress to provide subsidies to public schools for internet use. Vice President Dick Cheney was clearly was an influential figure in the Bush administration, although many of the Washington elite were happy to see Dick Cheney as vice president because of his intelligent and wide range of experience. He quickly became a controversial figure due to his outspoken support for a tough foreign and military policy and for having encouraged Bush to attack Iraq. Vice President Joe Biden, former senator from Delaware, was a popular choice for vice president among Democrats and voters. He had many years of experience in the Senate, thus balancing President Obama's relative lack of experience on Capitol Hill. Once the Obama administration took office, Biden's role became somewhat clearer. His experiences in the Senate prepared him to be a senior advisor to the president on foreign policy issues. Although he was not as controversial as figure as Cheney had been, of course, the vice president office and the vice president becomes president. Vice presidents sometimes have become elected presidents in their own right. John Adams and Thomas Jefferson were the first two vice presidents to win the office of president. Richard Nixon was elected president in 1968 after he had served as Dwight D. Eisenhower's vice president from 1953 to 1961. In 1988, George H.W. Bush was elected to presidency after 8 years as Ronald Reagan's vice president. Presidential succession. 8 vice presidents have become president upon the death of the president. John Tyler, the first to do so, took over William Henry Harrison's position only after 1 month. No one knew whether Tyler should simply be a caretaker until a new president could be elected 3 years and a half year later, or whether he actually should be president. Tyler assumed that he was supposed to be the chief executive, and he accused as such, although he was commonly referred to as His Excellency. Since then, Vice President taking over the position of the presidency because of the incumbent's death have assumed the presidential powers. But what should a vice president do if a president becomes incapable of carrying out necessary duties while in office? When James Garfield was shot in 1881, he survived for 2.5 months. What was Vice President Chester Arthur's role? This question was not addressed in the original Constitution. Article 2, Section 1 say only that in case of the removal of the president from office or of his death, resignation, or inability of discharge the powers of duties of the said office, the same shall devolve on the same powers shall be exercised by the vice president. Many instances of presidential disability have occurred. When Dwight Eisenhower became ill a second time in 1958, he entered into a pact with Richard Nixon specifying that the vice president could determine whether the president was incapable of carrying out his duties if the president could not communicate. John F. Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson entered into similar agreements with their vice president. In 1967, the 25th Amendment was ratified, establishing procedures in case of a presidential incapacity. So the 25th Amendment and 1967 Amendment to the Constitution that established procedures for filling presidential and vice presidential vacancies and makes provisions for presidential disability. The 25th Amendment. According to the 25th Amendment, when a president believes that he or she is incapable of performing the duties of office, the president must inform Congress in writing. Then the vice president serves as acting president until the president can resume normal duties. When the president is unable to communicate, the majority of the cabinet, including the vice president, can declare that fact to Congress. Then the vice president serves as an acting president until the president resumes normal duties. If a dispute arises over the return of the president's ability, 2/3 votes of Congress is required to decide whether the vice president shall remain acting president or whether the president shall resume normal duties. In 2002, President George W. Bush formally invoked the 25th Amendment for the first time by official transferring presidential power to Vice President Dick Cheney, while the president underwent a colonoscopy, a 20-minute procedure. He commented that he undertook this transfer of power because we are at war, referring to war on terrorism. The only other time the provision of the 25th Amendment had been used was during the President Reagan colon surgery in 1985, although Reagan did not formally invoke the amendment. When the vice president becomes vacant, the 25th Amendment also addresses the issue of how the president should fill a vacant vice presidency. Section 2 of the amendment simply states, whenever there is a vacancy in the office of the vice president, the president shall nominate a vice president who shall take office upon confirmation by a majority vote of both houses and Congress. This occurred when Richard Nixon, Vice President Spiro Agnew, resigned in 1973 because of his alleged receipt of construction contract kickbacks during the tenure as governor of Maryland. Nixon turned to Gerald Ford as his choice for vice president. After extensive hearings, both chambers of Congress confirmed the appointment. When Nixon resigned on August 9, 1974, Ford automatically became president and nominated Nixon Rockefeller as his vice president, which Congress confirmed. For the first time, neither the president nor the vice president had been elected to either position. The question of who shall be president if both the president and vice president die is answered by the Secession Act of 1947. If the president and vice president die, resign, or are disabled, the Speaker of the House will become president after resigning from Congress. Next in line is the President pro tem of the Senate, followed by the cabinet officers in order of the creation of the departments. See Table 12.2. And Table 12.2, there's a line of succession to presidency of the United States. So it's numbers 1 through 18. So the number 1 is vice president. So this is the line succession to the presidency of the United States. Number 1 is vice president. Number 2 is Speaker of the House of Representatives. Number 3 is Senate President pro tempore. Number 4 is Secretary of State. Number 5 is Secretary of Treasury. Number 6 is Secretary of Defense. Number 7 is Attorney General, head of the Justice Department. Number 8 is Secretary of Interior. Number 9 is Secretary of Agriculture. Number 10 is Secretary of Commerce. Number 11 is Secretary of Labor. Number 12 is Secretary of Health and Human Services. Number 13 is Secretary of House and Urban Development. Number 14 is Secretary of Transportation. Number 15 is Secretary of Energy. Number 16 is Secretary of Education. Number 17 is Secretary of Veterans Affairs. And number 18 is Secretary of Homeland Security. So there's a long line there, 18 people on the list to succeed for presidency in the United States if something were to happen to our president and vice president. So like that's pretty cool. They have that already set and lined up for us. Well, that completes the chapter for presidency. So I have a recap here. I can just briefly read that. So for the chapter summary, for 12.1, it says the office of the presidency in the United States, combining as it does the function of head of state and chief executive, was unique when it was created. The framers of the Constitution were divided over whether the president should be a weak or strong executive. 12.1. The requirements for the office of the presidency are outlined in Article 2, Section 1 of the Constitution and include both formal and informal duties. The role of the president include head of state, chief executive, commander-in-chief, chief diplomat, chief legislator, and party chief. 12.1. As head of state, the president is ceremonial leader of the government. As chief executive, the president is bound to enforce the acts of Congress, the judgments of the federal courts, and treaties. The chief executive has power of appointment and the power to grant reprieves and pardons. 12.1. Presidents are also the political leaders of their party, naming the leadership of the party and being the chief fundraiser for future elections. To become effective leaders and to gain support for their policies, presidents try to maintain strong approval ratings from the public, and as measured by frequent polls, the White House office works to improve the president's image and reputation through its relationship with the media. Presidents who maintain their popularity are likely to have more success in their legislative programs. 12.2. As commander-in-chief, the president is the ultimate decision maker in military matters. As chief diplomat, the president recognizes foreign governments, negotiates treaties, signs agreements, and nominates and receives ambassadors. 12.3. The role of chief legislator includes recommending legislations to Congress, lobbying for the legislations, approving laws, and exercising the veto power. The president also has statutory powers written into law by Congress. 12.4. Presidents have a variety of special powers not available to other branches of the government. These include emergency powers, most frequently used during war or the national crisis, and the power to issue executive orders or invoke executive privileges. 12.5. Abuses of executive power are addressed by Article 1 and 2 of the Constitution, which authorize the House and Senate to impeach and remove the president, vice president, and or other officers of the federal government for committing treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. 12.6. The president fulfills the role of chief executive by appointing individuals of his or her choice to positions in the department and agency of the government, as well as various advisors in the White House office and the executive office of the president. Some of the officers within the EOP were established by law, whereas others were appointed as the president desires. All appointees are supposed to be working for the president's initiative and making sure that the larger bureaucracy and also supportive of the president's programs. 12.7. The vice president is the constitutional officer assigned to preside over the Senate and to assume the presidency in the event of the death, resignation, removal, or disability of the president. The 25th Amendment, passed in 1967, established procedures to be followed in case of a presidential incapacity and when fulfilling a vacant vice presidency. So that is a quick recap. The rest is selected resources, so printed resources. There's some media resources here that can be found online, and then there's also some more online resources. If you wanted to visit the White House, you go to www.whitehouse.gov. And so that's where the president lives, y'all. They're in the White House. You can go and check that out. But that's it. So the next chapter is going to be about bureaucracy. So I'm not going to read that today. That's going to be for another time. And I'm just looking up that word. I think that's in relation to like money. It says a system of government in which most of the important decisions are made by state officials rather than by elected representatives. So a state or organization governed or managed as a bureaucracy, the officials in a bureaucracy considered as a group of hierarchy. So a system of government in which most of the important decisions are made by state officials rather than by elected representatives. So that's what we're gonna read about. Not today, it'll be another day. So there is a test coming. So the test is gonna be on 4 of the chapters here. So starting with, I believe, chapter 10. Let's make sure. So right now I'm on 12. So I think it goes back even further, actually. So I think it goes all the way back to 9. Chapter 9, 10, 11, 12. No, it goes back to 8. Chapter 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. Yeah, so from chapter 8 to chapter 12. So I'm going to be tested on. So I have to make sure that I know all that information, those 4 chapters. I'm just going to the contents here so I could read what those are about. So chapter 4 is civil liberties. Not chapter 4. I didn't mean chapter 4. I meant to go to 8. So this is what I'm going to be tested on. So chapter 8 is political parties. Chapter 9 is campaign, voting, and elections. Chapter 10 is media and politics. Chapter 11 is the Congress. And chapter 12 is the president. So I need to know political parties, campaigns, voting, and elections, the media and politics, the Congress, and the president. Well, that completes the study session for today. So thank y'all for joining. I hope y'all learned something. Until next time, take care.